You're listening to the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. A lot of the things we think we know about healthy relationships come from pop psychology. However, the problem with this is that the messages we're receiving are usually vast oversimplifications. Pop psychology encourages us to engage in all or nothing thinking, and it doesn't give us the skills we need to navigate very complex relationship issues that might require very nuanced solutions. So that's what we're going to be talking about in today's show. We're going to explore common relationship myths perpetuated by pop psychology and what you really need to know instead. Some of the topics we'll explore include whether codependency is inherently bad, whether you really need to love yourself before you can accept love from others, whether good relationships are supposed to be easy or hard, and so much more. We're also going to discuss how even good relationship advice often gets applied incorrectly and can sometimes cause more problems than it solves. I am joined by Casey Davis, the best-selling author of How to Keep House While Drowning. A licensed therapist, she is the creator of the popular Struggle Care website and Instagram and the Domestic Blisters TikTok. Her latest book is titled Who Deserves Your Love? How to Create Boundaries to Start, Strengthen, or End Any Relationship. This is going to be another fascinating episode. Stick around and we're going to jump in right after the break. Are you looking for a space that celebrates diverse perspectives, explores new frontiers, and brings all of your favorite people together? The annual Sexological Conference, hosted by Sexual Health Alliance, is where sexuality leaders gather. This conference connects you with world-class experts, leading sexuality companies, and a community of like-minded, passionate, and welcoming professionals. You'll find your people at the Sexual Health Alliance Annual Sexological Conference this October. Get your ticket to be inspired, educated, and empowered. Note that this conference is open to anyone and everyone. Head over to sexualhealthalliance.com, select the Annual Sexological Conference page, and save your spot today. Hi, Casey, and welcome to the show.
Hi, happy to be here.
Well, thanks so much for joining me. So you have a new book out called Who Deserves Your Love? And at the beginning of it, you talk about how you kind of accidentally became a relationship therapist. You say that you started out as an addiction therapist. So tell us a little bit about how working with clients with substance use disorders set you down the path of really understanding and working with relationship dynamics.
Yeah, there's this interesting needle to thread when we talk about relationships where we want to acknowledge that other people's behavior has an impact on us. And we want to acknowledge that we still have agency, right? We don't want to blame everything on someone else. And I think I didn't expect how much when I decided I wanted to treat addiction that I was going to be focusing on threading that needle. Because we had lots of people who have gone through trauma. And people would come in and they would make a lot of strides. And then they'd go back to their family and their family would be really toxic. And you would just see this kind of backslide, so hard to use their new tools, things like that. And then we would also see the opposite. We would see these like almost perfect families, these loving parents and spouses and children and someone who just couldn't seem to function without using and drinking. And then we would also see people where they would get a lot of great skills while they were in rehab, but then like the battleground of practicing those skills are in relationships with other people. And I quickly realized that while I loved treating people that had addictions, I really loved treating their families. Because a lot of families wanted to believe, hey, this is not my problem. This is their problem. They need to fix it. And a lot of clients wanted to believe, I am a victim of my family because they're so toxic. And we kind of had to bring both parties together and say, okay, it's neither and it's both. Like, yes, as a family member, you cannot control whether they get sober or not, but your behavior does have an impact and have an influence. And I think it's that tightrope of we can't control other people, and yet we can influence their health by the way that we act.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. That all makes total sense to me, especially in the context of understanding something like addiction. There are so many relational components to that. If you're talking about the romantic relationship that someone might have, if you're talking about the relationship that they have with their kids, with their family, with their friends, yeah, lots of complicated, complex relationship dynamics at play there. But what you talk about in your book is that the things that you've learned in terms of helping people with substance use disorders navigate their relationships is very broadly applicable to people without substance use disorders, right? Because most people struggle with relationships in one way or another, whether substance use is present or not.
Yeah, it was all the same dynamics. It was just almost higher stakes
Yep.
when you're dealing with someone that has an addiction because like their coping skill isn't going to be, yelling for a few minutes or walking out of the door. Like their coping skill is going to put their life in danger,
Yep.
right? If they kind of get really distressed. And so it's all the same dynamics, but I kind of had to learn it in the trenches, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So your book offers a different way of thinking about relationship dynamics. And I want to talk about how your perspective is different. So let's start by debunking some common myths about relationships that have been perpetuated by pop psychology. Now, one of them is this idea that codependency is inherently bad. Now, we don't necessarily want to be completely codependent, but our relationships need to have at least some degree of codependency in order to thrive. So tell us a little bit about that. How did codependency become a dirty word, and why do we need to think about it differently?
The reason I don't use the term codependency is because it's come to have some implications that I don't like. And yet, a lot of people that use the word codependency when they're describing themselves are describing a very real struggle.
Mm-hmm.
And so I want to sort of acknowledge that that is a real struggle and talk about why I think those of us that are helping people in relationships should move away from this idea of codependency. Because I think at this point, it kind of gets boiled down to this idea that having any kind of emotional needs is being codependent.
Yep.
Being affected by somebody else's behavior is being codependent. Your self-worth being affected by someone's behavior is codependent. And yes, we all want to have a sense of self where we don't have to have every single person we meet like us or we spin out and have an existential crisis. But we also can't believe the far end of this spectrum on the other side, that if I was just healthy enough, nothing would affect me. If I was just secure enough, that cruelty wouldn't hurt me. And I think that that is an important thing to recognize, that we are supposed to be interdependent people, that we are supposed to rely on each other, and we're supposed to be affected by the behavior of others. And we don't want to have a victim mindset where every problem in our life is somebody else's problem and we can't look at ourselves. But we also don't want to have this belief that like we're supposed to have this Zen state of untouchableness all the time. And this idea that like we don't owe anyone anything, I think is problematic. We do owe people things, especially the people that we choose to be in relationships with.
Yeah, I think those are all really important points. And I think it kind of gets at this bigger issue of how a lot of therapy speak has kind of crept into the way that people talk more broadly on social media and in their own lives about relationships. And I think a lot of what is said kind of gets taken to an extreme. And, what you're saying about this idea that people feel like they need to be completely self-reliant is a big misconception. I was trained as a social psychologist and trained under the theoretical model of interdependence theory. And, it's really about this idea that we are all fundamentally interdependent in our relationships, and we need to have some level of interdependence in order for our relationships to function, to be healthy, to survive. So certainly you can also take things too far. We talk also about in our research this idea of the inclusion of self and other, and that's kind of where the codependency idea comes into play, is that some people see themselves and their partners as being completely cognitively merged. And, we find that it's unhealthy when people take things to that extreme, but you need to have some merging of your sense of self and your partners to have that level of interdependence that really allows your relationship to function in a healthy way.
And I think I have a lot of empathy for people who, anytime you have a concept that is real and true and helpful, it hits a point where it's so well known that people who are acting in bad faith begin to weaponize it.
Yeah.
Right. And so it is true that I want to have like what we, refer to obviously as like the internal locus of control. Like I don't want every person's opinion or actions towards me to rock me to my core, to where I feel every single disapproval so deeply and I can't distinguish like, hey, that person's just allowed to not like me. It doesn't mean anything's wrong with me. But we also see where a very well-meaning concept of nobody can make you feel anything. That's a helpful concept when you're maybe dealing with a parent that's very emotionally immature and you have asked them for something very reasonable, like, hey, do you think you can call before you just stop by? And they go, I can't believe you. You make me feel like I am the worst mother in the world. I mean, in that circumstance, it seems helpful to say, okay, I didn't make my mom feel that way, right? Like that's my mom having an experience that I did not cause. And yet you also have people who will weaponize that and they'll be in a fight with someone and be calling them horrible, degrading names and, maybe even throw something. And then if that person tries to say like, this is really frightening to me, or I feel really disrespected, you have someone all of a sudden go, well, I can't make you feel anything. And I think that that's always kind of what I'm thinking about is, where was the truth in this statement and where is it accurately applied? And where do we want to like go to the fringe and like bring people back from where maybe this has been co-opted in bad faith?
Yeah, makes total sense to me. There is a lot in the world of therapy and psychology that has been co-opted in some unhealthy and unhelpful ways. Now, something else that we hear about in the world of relationship self-help books is that we need to love ourselves before we can accept love from other people. I mean, I think RuPaul even says that too. Now, you say that's not necessarily true. So why is that?
This came from a couple of things. I got sober really young. I was like 16. So I was in a troubled teen industry. I got out and joined a pretty evangelical church for a few years. And one of the things that centered around both of those communities was this idea, and it kind of came packaged where it was like, if you want romantic love, that's a weakness, that you should be totally content by yourself without wanting romantic love. And the only way you're going to get romantic love is by being content without romantic love, right? Whether that's over spiritualized into, when you don't want it, that's when God will give it to you, or whether it's kind of hijacked on the other end of the spectrum where we're just talking about wellness, where it's like, well, you'll attract it, you'll manifest it, or only when you are secure with yourself will it be there. And I think that that's kind of a load of horseshit. Sorry, like it is. It's so unfair to put people in that position because, like we said, it is normal and healthy to crave and even yearn for connection, whether that's family connection, romantic connection, friendship connection. It doesn't mean there's something wrong with us. There's nothing inherently more enlightened or healthy about not wanting romance. Now, certainly we can have the problem where we cannot ever be alone. And the only way we know how to manage our own emotions and identity and self-concept is through someone else's eyes, right? But I think most people are somewhere in between. And I think this idea that unless I am fully healed, I don't deserve a relationship can be really damaging because there's so much healing that can only happen in relationships. I think everybody can probably relate to this idea where we think we're so healthy and then we get in a relationship with someone and we're like, wait a second, there are issues coming up that I thought I had buttoned up years ago that are suddenly rearing its head when there's somebody else in my proximity.
That makes a lot of sense to me. And, this idea that you need to kind of have this perfect relationship with yourself before you can be open to love, I think can also make it feel like love is impossible because it's really hard for a lot of people to have that perfect relationship with themselves where they accept and love themselves unconditionally. So we need some balance here. It's again, taking things to the extreme is kind of where we see the problems arise.
I think it's kind of ironic that even therapists will sometimes say that because they're literally sitting in a room in a profession that literally hinges on the idea that healing happens in the context of that relationship.
Yep.
We know that the relationship that you form with your therapist is the most important healing modality you have. And of course, the therapist is being paid to be kind of that blank slate. They're being paid to put their stuff on the back burner. They're being paid to just think about your needs. But that's like the safe place to practice these new skills, because it's much harder when you're in a relationship with someone who they have their own needs they're bringing to the table. They have their own trauma they're bringing to the table. And both of you have to kind of tango it out on meeting each other's needs and meeting your own needs and walking that tightrope. And so, we kind of get this safe relationship to practice with. So I've always thought it was ironic for a therapist to say, like, you can heal without being in a relationship, because sure, you can if you don't have a relationship, I guess, but there's not a level of heal you have to get to deserve being in one.
Yeah, definitely. Now, society often prioritizes romantic relationships over non-romantic ones. And we often see this idea perpetuated in the world of relationship science. So, for example, back when I was in graduate school studying the psychology of relationships, we read paper after paper talking about how people in romantic relationships are just way better off than singles. We learned that partnered folks, especially those who are married, have better physical and mental health, as well as greater life satisfaction. And it really kind of gave the impression that not having a romantic partner was something that was like necessarily hazardous to your health, and that romantic relationships are really the only ones that matter in our lives. But that's not exactly true, is it? So talk to us a little bit about how non-romantic relationships can be just as valuable in our lives as the romantic ones.
Well, one of the things that I think is really interesting when I talk about my book, and I talk about it being a relationship book, the number one question I get is it just about romantic relationships? And I'm so happy to be able to say it's not. Like, it's about platonic relationships and family relationships and adult children and their parents and parents and their adult, like, it's about all relationships, including romantic relationships. But I think that just speaks to this idea that the majority of the meaningful relationships in our lives are not romantic. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting to me about studies like that, where they look at partnered people in romantic relationships, is I always want to know, like, what's the control group there? Right? Because in order to know what the actual variables are that are making the difference, you have to have a control group. And so if we're comparing it to people who are single and what? Single and living alone? Single and living with friends? Single and living in community? It's because, like, there's a part of that we tend to think it's the romance that makes the difference, because that makes life so much more meaningful. And yet, I think everyone can agree that life is really hard sometimes. And a big part of it is just having someone else to do life with you and do those burdens. But B, how much of that is a self-fulfilling prophecy? Like, our society is so centered on romantic love that we have this nuclear family idea. So I was very engaged with my friends in my early 20s. We did everything together. We lived as roommates. We often worked at the same places. We saw each other multiple times a week. That's who you called when you needed someone to talk to. That's who you called when you needed to move. But what happened was, as everybody partnered up, they pulled away from that group. They pulled away from that community, because now they're kind of doing partner life. And we're led to believe that that's really normal. And so what happens is that people that don't end up partnered romantically don't really have as many people to lean on sometimes, because everyone's prioritizing that romantic relationship. And I'm not saying it's right or wrong to prioritize your romantic relationship. I'm just saying, like, is it that the romantic relationship is inherently more beneficial to your health, or is it us prioritizing it over everything else that's kind of created an environment where people who are not paired romantically are kind of like left adrift at sea, because we're not living in the type of communities or even multi-generational households that would allow us to have the benefits of living with someone, of having someone to carry those burdens, of having someone that knows you deeply.
Yeah, I think the science in this area has become a bit more nuanced in recent years. This idea that just being in a relationship is good for your health. Well, if you're in an unhealthy relationship, staying in that toxic dynamic is not necessarily going to be good for you long term. And also, just because you're single, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be unfulfilled. And when you look at singles who do have a robust social network and connections, they're doing just as well and thriving, compared to people in relationships. So yeah, there's a very nuanced story to tell there. And it really depends on the quality of the connections that you have with other people, whether they're romantic or non-romantic. Date nights are supposed to bring you closer, right? They're a chance to disconnect from the stress of daily life and reconnect with your partner. But if we're being honest, sometimes they start to feel more like a chore or a checklist than quality time. When your date nights start to become too predictable, they can feel more like something you have to do than something you really want to do because you've lost that spark that made them really exciting and special in the first place. That's where Beducated comes in. Beducated is a pleasure-positive learning platform that can help you and your partner explore deeper connection, intimacy, and fun in the bedroom. 2 courses I can't recommend enough are Tantric Date Nights and Sexperiments for Couples. Tantric Date Nights helps you to slow down, tune in, and actually feel present with each other. You'll learn breathwork, sensual touch techniques, and how to build emotional intimacy, all in very practical and accessible ways. Then there's Sexperiments for Couples, which is a playful guide to trying new things together. From sensory play to spontaneity practices that will help you to transform the predictable into the exciting, you'll discover a new adventure in every lesson. These courses are designed to bring you closer on every level. So if your date nights could use a little shakeup, try something that actually sparks connection. Beducated is where toe-curling pleasure meets expert-backed education. Get 60% off their yearly pass by using my last name, Laymiller, as the coupon code. Try Beducated risk-free with a 14-day money-back guarantee. Check the show notes for the link and be sure to use my last name to get your discount. Now, when it comes to relationship advice, we hear a lot of conflicting and contradictory things, right? So, for example, on the one hand, we often hear that good relationships are supposed to be easy. And at the same time, we often hear that relationships are just supposed to be hard. And again, when taken to the extreme, I think both of these pieces of advice are bad. If you operate under this idea that relationships should always be easy, you're probably setting yourself up for a lot of disappointment. But if you think relationships are always supposed to be hard, then you might end up staying in some toxic situations that you really should have gotten out of a long time ago. So how should we think about this? Are relationships supposed to be hard or easy?
This is such a great question. And you've really nailed what people struggle with. It's like, I don't want to demand too much, but I don't want to accept too little. Mm-hmm. And there's kind of 2 concepts that I think are really helpful with this. I tried to define what's considered like a good relationship in the book. And I kind of came up with this idea that a good relationship, when it's good, it's really good. And when it's bad, it's safe. A lot of people have a lot of opinions on what a relationship should look like, on what kind of behavior is acceptable, what healthy looks like. And I think it's hard if you've never really been a client-facing mental health person or a therapist to appreciate how varied healthy relationships can look. There are people that have high highs and low lows and are really intense people that have healthy relationships. And there are other people where they're having these high highs and their low lows, and the intensity is kind of toxic. And you have people who everything is kind of temperate and it feels easy and there's not a lot of conflict. And that's because they have a great relationship. But then you have other people where things are easy and temperate and there's low conflict, but they're not connected at all.
Right.
They're kind of sort of avoiding things, or they're not really attracted to one another, or they're just kind of comfortable. And so it's really hard to say one certain behavior, right? Like outside of abuse and mistreatment, which I'll talk about too, like it's hard to say that healthy relationships always look like this. And so that's kind of what I came up with, is that, yeah, you should love and be in love. And, if it's not a romantic relationship, then it should be someone you feel drawn to and you feel really happy and it's great and it's good. But when it's not, it should at least be safe. So we want both of those things. And then the other thing that I like to do is kind of give people 3 categories of mistakes or screw ups, because none of us are perfect. We're going to make mistakes. And again, as a therapist, I've seen big mistakes. It's really easy online to say things like, you should never, ever forgive someone for cheating on you. You should never, put up with someone raising their voice at you. And I want people going into dating relationships to have really high standards for the way that they're treated. And I've been doing this long enough to know that life is just a little more nuanced than that. And so instead, I want people to understand what behaviors might mean. Like there are screw ups, there is mistreatment, and there is abuse. And so screw ups are behavior that is hurtful or harmful, but it happens sometimes. And for the most part, the majority of the time that that person is screwing up, they are trying to apologize. They are trying to see their side of it. They are trying to make changes so that the relationship is getting better and not worse. If you have someone who is screwing up a lot and there's a pattern of them not wanting to address it, or there's a pattern of them saying that they're going to address it, but then not actually addressing it, you are starting to look at a different category of hard, quote unquote, right? Which is mistreatment. And so when we talk about, how hard is too hard, well, you might have a spouse that has cheated and it happened once. Maybe there was a lot of trauma involved. Maybe there was some conflict where in the conflict, both of them were at fault and it created a lot of distance. And one person was really vulnerable and they made the bad decision to cheat in that relationship. And it's an extremely painful situation, right? And then let's say that we have someone who rolls their eyes at their partner and is a little dismissive sometimes. Well, it would be easy to look at those behaviors together and say, well, one of those isn't as big of a deal. One of that's it's not that big of a deal to roll your eyes or be dismissive. Yes, it's hurtful. Yes, they shouldn't do it, but that's not abusive. That's not this. But if you have someone who has been unfaithful once and has done the work to go, I recognize how we got in this scenario. I don't want to ever be in this scenario again. I want to make amends. I want to be different. That's actually a very different situation than someone who is chronically dismissing their partner, who is always making their partner feel as though the things they like are stupid. And they're not saying that, but they're rolling their eyes and they're being dismissive. And every time their partner tries to talk to them about that, they're going, well, I don't do that. I don't do that. Or they're saying, okay, I'm sorry, I'll stop. But they don't. That is actually a much more unhealthy relationship. That is a much more toxic relationship. And as a therapist, I am much more worried about your well-being in that relationship than I am in, the other relationship I'm referring to. And I think infidelity is actually a great example of it can be a screw up. It can be mistreatment. You have someone being unfaithful over and over and over, or dismissing it or covering it up, refusing. And then we also have this third category of abuse, where someone is doing something hurtful or harmful. There is that pattern of refusing to address it or giving lip service to addressing it and not really ever addressing it. And there is a third component of coercion, control, degradation, or humiliation. And so compare that first example of two people on equal footing who are both contributing to the disconnection. One of them was vulnerable. They made a horrible decision, and that person wants to work on it. Compare that to a spouse who is chronically unfaithful, and their other spouse does not have the financial freedom to leave. And that spouse is either coming home and rubbing it in their face, or is getting caught over and over and over and clearly has no intention to do anything, but knows that they don't actually have to change because the other person has no leverage. They have no financial freedom, or they have no other connections, or, they're using language like, I wouldn't be cheating if you gave me what I needed. And there's this degradation, this coercion. So you can see how one behavior can be three different things. And I think people recognizing what part of hard does their relationship fall into is a much better answer for what does it mean for a relationship to be hard.
Yeah, I appreciate that very thoughtful and nuanced answer. And I think it gets at this idea that a lot of us want things in relationships to be very clear cut in terms of our understanding of them and say, here are our red lines. And if this happens or you engage in this behavior, then that's it. I'm going to leave. We're going to break up. We're going to divorce. And, you give a good example with something like infidelity. Now, I realize infidelity is a huge red flag for a majority of people, but not all infidelity is the same. And there are a lot of couples who end up working through it and their relationship can actually come out stronger on the other side. But it depends, what is the context of this? And does the person who committed infidelity really want to work on the relationship and really never have that happen again. That is, as you say, very different from somebody who is weaponizing infidelity, using it in this abusive way, or somebody who uses it as a form of, mistreatment for their partner and just doesn't really care about it. Like, these aren't all the same thing. And, it'd be nice to have these simple, clear-cut rules like that we could apply to our relationships, but they're more complicated than that.
And sometimes people don't like when you point out that infidelity can be very different, that most behaviors can be very different, because they think what you're saying is it's acceptable.
Right.
Or it's reasonable, or it's okay, or you shouldn't leave someone for that. And that's not what we're saying at all. Like, whether or not you should leave someone for a behavior is actually a completely different conversation. And it has less to do with like which category it's falling into than you might think. It is any person's, like, I often, when I talk about this, I'll get a comment that's like, this is wrong. The first time someone cheats, I'm out of there. I don't care. And it's always like, that's your prerogative. Like, you get to make those kinds of decisions and have those kinds of boundaries. It's not saying that it's okay if it was just a one-time screw up. Like, how sympathetic you are to the reasons why someone hurt you is not the only variable or even the most important variable to how you should respond to that hurt or that harm.
Yeah, and I've seen this come up time and again in talking about infidelity, whether it's on social media or elsewhere, where there are lots of people who will say, well, you're legitimizing infidelity. And it's like, no, we're not saying that it's okay or that it's morally justified or anything along those lines. It's just the context, circumstances, situations can be drastically different in one relationship compared to another. And I don't think there's anything wrong with somebody who decides, this is my hard line and I'm going to leave if my partner cheats. And I also don't think we should judge people who decide to stay with somebody who had cheated on them, because they are allowed and entitled to make their own decisions and do what's right for them and for their relationship.
Yeah.
So you say in your book that the biggest problem with relationship advice isn't bad advice. It's good advice that's applied incorrectly. So can you tell us what you mean by this and maybe give us an example?
Yeah. So one great one that we kind of touched on is this idea of like, people can't make you feel things. Mm-hmm. And there was this phrase that would kind of float around that said like, no one can make you feel anything without your permission. And I don't think that's like a horrible thing. There are contexts in which I would bring up your agency with you. I was talking to a friend recently and they were sharing something about a family member that was just driving them nuts because their family member was really unreasonable and they had been so patient and they were really trying to work with them, but they just kept getting mistreated. And I finally said to them, your family member sounds unreasonable, sounds like someone who is never going to be reasonable. And it sounds like, while I agree with you that behavior in and of itself is always going to be distressing, a good part of your distress is actually you continuing to expect her to act reasonable. Mm-hmm. Like you go in, you're doing the right thing and you're just so frustrated that she's not doing the right thing because you're playing by the rules and she's not playing by the rules. And it's like, yeah, you're right. That sucks. That's unfair. And a great deal of this distress could get decreased in your life if you came to the table prepared for your loved one to be unreasonable and you started treating them like they were unreasonable. It's not to say that like it's acceptable or you should roll over or you shouldn't have boundaries. But in that scenario, talking about, some of this distress actually isn't being caused by your family member. Like you have control over some of this distress. That would be the appropriate place. Like that's good advice. And yet, I think we all agree is we might disagree where on the spectrum it turns. But by the time we get to someone threw something at your head, there is nobody that would say, well, you can't feel fear at that unless you give them permission. Or like, if somebody's going on a smear campaign against you or someone is calling you awful, degrading words, this idea that, you can't have low self-esteem from these horrible things they're saying unless you give them permission. And again, that's good advice applied incorrectly. Yeah. And again, the disagreement isn't that there's somewhere on the spectrum where that doesn't apply. It's kind of like, where on the spectrum is it?
Yep. Well, thank you so much for all of this amazing information, Casey. I'm really looking forward to continuing our conversation in the next episode and talking all about boundaries in relationships.
Me too.
Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work and get a copy of your new book?
Yeah, so my website is called Struggle Care. And from there, you can kind of get everywhere. You can get my book, Who Deserves Your Love. You can go to my socials. I'm Domestic Blisters on TikTok. I also have Facebook and Instagram under the handle Struggle Care. And I've got some cool downloads and things on my website. And that's where you can find me.
Well, great. And I'll be sure to include links to all of that in the show notes. Thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate having you here.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please consider becoming a Sex and Psychology premium subscriber to enjoy ad-free listening for just $3.99 a month. You can also follow me on social media for daily sex research updates. I'm on Blue Sky and X at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.